Okay, let's get into this. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at something, well, it's more than just historical true crime. We are dissecting history right at a flashpoint.
A moment of catastrophic collision?
Exactly. We've got 3 incredibly disturbing cases for you, and they span this really critical period from 1895 up to 1922.
And that specific quarter century is just fascinating because you have the world, undeniably modernizing. There are factories, railways, global communication is becoming a thing.
Right.
And yet these deeply, deeply rooted belief systems from the Middle Ages, they still have this profound and in these cases lethal grip on what people do.
So you're seeing this battle for authority playing out in courtrooms, in small communities.
Everywhere.
Absolutely. So our mission for you today is to analyze these 3 stories. We're going from German Pomerania to rural Tipperary and then to this isolated part of Brittany. And each one, the most impossible acts of human depravity, they were first blamed on the supernatural.
Werewolves, fairies, changelings.
Right. And we want to understand how cold, hard fact, this fervent, unshakable faith, and just outright confusion, how they all battled it out, not just in the courtrooms, but in the public mind.
It's a real study in contrast. This is the era when the forensic microscope is really learning to speak for the first time. But the whispers of werewolves and fairies are still loud enough to guide human hands.
Often towards just horrific violence.
Yes. So we've structured this deep dive for you, the listener, to really examine that whole spectrum.
So we're going to look at one case where this emerging science delivers the definitive, just undeniable answer. It basically silences folklore forever.
Then we pivot to a case where superstition tragically wins. It just completely takes over and leads to a brutal, horrifying murder.
And finally, a third case, one where the rise of modern investigation, all the new techniques, they just fail utterly. And the truth is left hopelessly buried under all these contradictory facts.
We are stepping right into the crossroads of folklore and forensics. And the goal here is to show not just what happened, but why these conflicts of belief really came to define a new century of justice.
So we begin in Germany, 1901, with a story where this ancient, terrifying folklore was about to get shouted down by the irreversible authority of modern forensic science.
The setting is just perfect for this. The small, quiet island of Rugen, nestled in the Baltic Sea, just off the coast name.
And life there was.
Right?
Well, it was simple. It was agrarian, and it was utterly predictable.
A world of routine, and that routine was just violently shattered on July 1st, 1901.
Why?
2 little boys, 6-year-old Peter Stuba and his older brother, 8-year-old Herman, they wandered off from their village. Garan, it was called. They were just going to pick blackberries near the edge of a dense forest.
A perfectly normal, everyday thing for kids to do.
Exact. But when they didn't come back for supper, the parents, they immediately got worried. They alerted the neighbors, the local police constable.
They searched all night. But that initial fear, the one where you just think your kids are lost,
Yeah.
that was very quickly replaced by something much, much worse. A kind of primal horror the next morning.
The scene they found in that forest was, it was utterly savage. It went so far beyond any local violence anyone there had ever seen or heard of. The killer hadn't just murdered the children.
Wow.
He had brutally dismembered them and then scattered their bodies over an area of more than 500 meters.
And it's the specifics, isn't it? The specifics of the mutilation are what immediately triggered this, like a historical memory for the people in that region, Pomerania.
Precisely. Peter's skull had been crushed, his neck was severed, his intestines had been pulled out, and most disturbingly, his heart had been cleanly removed from his chest.
And the older boy?
Herman was cut in half, his legs were separated from his torso, found a long way away, and his heart was also missing. It was never found.
This isn't just murder. You can feel it. It's ritualistic, it's savagery. And the villagers, they instantly connected it to something ancient, something they already feared.
Yeah, the horrific nature of it all. The dismemberment, the organ removal. It immediately reminded everyone of these recent unexplained attacks on livestock. Sheep nearby had been found slaughtered and mutilated. Their remains were scattered in the same senseless way. So when they're faced with this incomprehensible violence against children, the natural explanation for many people in this very tradition-heavy region, it wasn't just human depravity.
It was anything else.
It was the supernatural. Whispers of witchcraft, demonic possession, the werewolf. They started.
That context is so important. We're not talking about, say, the industrial Ruhr Valley. We're talking about German Pomerania and Mecklenburg, they were strongholds of this deep pre-industrial folklore.
Absolutely. The stories about forest spirits, about witches, and crucially about the werewolf, they survived far longer here. The source materials we have confirm that the local newspapers actually use the term werewolf murder.
So they're leaning right into it.
They are. They're lending credence to this idea that the killer was some kind of monstrous hybrid, not just a man. For the local people, this wasn't just a crime. It was. It was an encounter with a monster.
But the police, I mean, even though they're aware of the werewolf rumors, they are pursuing a more tangible lead.
Yes, a single witness came forward, and this witness reported seeing the two boys chatting with a local carpenter named Ludwig Tesno that very afternoon, not far from where the first body parts were discovered.
So they find Tesno.
They locate him on a beach near a town called Bit, and when they question him, he's remarkably calm, composed, rational.
Which is not what you'd expect.
Not at all. He denied seeing the boys. He claimed he'd been working at home all day, and this calm demeanor, it almost immediately worked in his favor, because the prevailing psychological theory of the era suggested that only people showing obvious signs of mania or mental distress could commit acts this extreme, this grotesque.
But his physical appearance, that told a different story.
It did. A search of his modest home immediately turned up damp, recently washed clothing, his jacket, his trousers, and especially his heavy leather. They were all covered in these stubborn, dark stains.
He'd tried to clean them?
It was clear he'd tried to scrub them clean, but the stains just persisted.
Tesno, though, he had a ready explanation. A reasonable-sounding one.
He did. He claimed they were just wood dye and varnish from his carpentry work. And given his profession, that was entirely plausible.
And the investigators were stuck. They're at an immediate impasse. And the reason they're stuck is it's deeply rooted in the history of forensics itself.
It is. This is where we have to look back a few, because the Rugen murders weren't the first time Ludwig Tesno had been suspected of this exact kind of crime. We have to rewind to 1890. 3 years earlier, near a place called Lechting, two 7-year-old girls, Elsa Langemeier and Hannelore Heidmann, were found butchered, dismembered, and scattered in a forest, in a pattern that was eerily, disturbingly similar to Superboy.
And Tesno was seen near those woods in 1898, wearing stained clothes. And he gave the exact same excuse, would die.
The exact same excuse. And in 1898, the police had to let him go.
Why? I mean,
not because they believed him, but because of the limitations of the science at the time. They were powerless to prove that the stains were human blood.
So the police knew. They likely knew they had a serial killer, this monstrous figure just walking among them. And they legally couldn't touch him because of a technical limitation. They just couldn't tell the difference between blood and dye.
That's the entire conflict right there. Before 1901, investigators relied on these really unreliable methods to test for blood. They used crystal tests like the Florence test or the Teichmann test.
And what could those do?
Well, they could detect hemoglobin, which is in blood, but they couldn't distinguish between human blood or sheep blood or varnish residue if the sample was dried or old or heavily diluted.
So pretty useless in a case like...
Almost. The only certain method was observation. And when you're faced with a calm, rational suspect like Tesno, that failed completely. They even found a small button matching his suit near the 1898 crime scene.
But they couldn't link the blood.
Exactly. So the button was disregarded as inconclusive. The police had a monster they couldn't legally prosecute.
But this time, in 1901, everything had changed. Tesno's fate, and really the fate of forensic science globally, it all rested on the work of one man, Dr. Paul
Uhlenhuth. He was a bacteriologist at the University of Greifswald, and he had been trying to solve a problem that plagued horses all over the world.
Which was?
How do you prove a blood stain came from a human being and not an animal? This was the ultimate loophole for killers. They'd just claim they were butchers or hunters.
And Uhlenhuth, he delivers the breakthrough in February 1901. Just 5 months before the Rugen murders. The timing is, it's almost unbelievable.
It truly is. He developed what became known as the precipitin test. And it was revolutionary because it was the first ever species-specific blood test. To really get why this was such a colossal legal breakthrough, you have to understand the mechanism, core concept.
Okay, so let's unpack the science for the listener, because this is the moment modern forensic science really begins.
Right. So Uhlenhuth realized that if you injected blood from one species, say human blood, into another animal, usually a rabbit,
right,
the rabbit's immune system would recognize the foreign protein, the ant, and it would produce these specific defensive proteins. He called them precipitins. We call them antibodies.
And those antibodies are like specialized keys that are designed to fit only one specific lock.
That is the perfect analogy, exactly. So Uhlenhuth would then carefully extract this resulting antibody serum from the rabbit. If that serum was then mixed with a diluted sample of human blood, the mixture would react strongly. You'd see this visible, undeniable precipitation, a clumping, right where they met.
But if you mixed it with anything else?
Nothing. If that same serum was mixed with, say, sheep blood or dog blood, there would be no reaction at all.
So for the very first time, police could move past just looking at a stain or using these vague chemical tests, and they could definitively state this stain came from a human being.
That's the monumental step. When Tesno was arrested, Uhlenhuth was immediately brought in to test the stained item. The case became famous all over Germany as the Blutprobe Fall, the blood test case. He personally supervised and conducted the whole analysis on the coat, the trousers, the cap, the boots, everything.
And the results were just utterly devastating for Tesno's calm, rational facade and for his wood dye excuse.
They were, and what's interesting is that Uhlenhuth did confirm that some of the stains were wood dye.
Really?
Yes, which ironically made Tesno's story a little more believable to the public at first, but the vast majority, they were undeniably scientifically proven to be human blood. He found traces on 6 different areas of his coat, 7 spots on his trousers, 4 on his waistcoat, and on his cap and vest as well.
And the final piece of evidence, the one that tied Tesno to the whole saga, including the werewolf rumors, that was the animal blood.
Yes. Uhlenhuth also found traces of sheep's blood on the clothing. This conclusively linked Tesno not just to the murder of the Stuba boys, but also to those recent sheep mutilations that had fueled the initial fears of a supernatural monster. The evidence was now irrefutable. Tesno was lying.
The era where a killer could simply lie about the sorts of blood on their clothes was over. Science had linked a suspect to murder through species-specific blood testing for the very first time in history.
So when the trial began in 1902, the defense, they tried everything to undermine Uhlenhuth. They claimed his test was unproven, it was experimental, that it was just coincidence being dressed up as certainty.
They argued that science shouldn't trump, eyewitness testimony and traditional legal standards.
But Uhlenhuth's testimony was just so rigorous, and the entire scientific community backed him up. The evidence presented in this clear clinical detail, it just overwhelmed. So the debate shifted immediately. It went from guilt to mental responsibility.
And that became the central battlefield, didn't it? The emerging field of psychiatry versus the court's traditional desire for retribution.
Exact. Tesno had been under observation at a sanitarium. 6 different, very high-profile psychiatrists all concluded he was severely insane, not mentally accountable for his actions.
And what was their reasoning?
They pointed to the bizarre, elaborate staging of the crimes, the fact that he spent hours meticulously moving and arranging body parts. That's not consistent with a rational killer trying to cover his tracks, but it is entirely consistent with someone in a state of psychosis.
But the prosecutor, he just dismissed the psychiatric reports entirely. Yeah. He focused instead on the certainty that Uhlenhuth's science provided. This is a profound moment in legal history.
It is. The court was effectively saying that the physical evidence, the blood, was more trustworthy than the complex subjective analysis.
That's a critical shift in judicial authority. The court, eager to deliver justice for these horrific crimes, found Tesno guilty of the murder and sentenced him to death by guillotine on December 14th, 1902.
Which immediately caused this huge outrage in the psychiatric and legal communities because German law actually prohibited capital punishment for crimes committed under diminished mental capacity.
So society, through the court, decided that certainty in identification, which science provided, was more important than understanding the killer's madness.
They chose certainty over complexity. The execution was scheduled for 1903, but the night before, Tesno suffered a violent seizure which forced a postponement.
And his defense used that.
They did. They successfully argued his clear mental illness warranted a reprieve. A second trial followed. The same science versus psychiatry debate played out, and again, the jury sent to death.
Now, the popular story, the one you usually hear, often ends with his execution in 1904. But later research by historians and forensic psychiatrists, it shows that his story took an even darker, more bizarre turn.
Yes, that's right. Historians like Andreas Albus, they found records suggesting Tesno's death sentence was quietly commuted to life in prison. He was transferred in 1930 to Strassen State Mental Hospital, where he remained for decades, listed as an uncured.
And the final horrific irony is that this monstrous killer who symbolized the ancient fear of the werewolf, he ultimately fell victim to a monstrous, methodical, modern state.
In November 1939, Ludwig Tesno was among 300 patients executed by the SS in the Paschnica meth. This was part of the Nazi Action T4 euthanasia program. Systemized, industrial-scale killing of the mentally and chronic. Source material captures this paradox. A monstrous killer consumed by an even larger, more technologically organized.
And speaking of dark legacy, the scientist who gave us this incredible breakthrough, Paul Uhlen, his reputation was also tarnished in the decades that followed.
It was. Uhlenhuth's test was adopted as court-admissible evidence in Prussia in 1900, and it spread globally, becoming the conceptual grandfather of modern DNA profile. But Uhlenhuth himself, he later served the Nazis. He became associated with the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute and misused his scientific authority to propose and support these unethical, dark experiments, including forced immunization trials on prisoners.
So the whole case just stands as this terrifying mark. Science had proven its power to uncover fact, but the ethical and moral compass of the modern world was still dangerously flawed. Okay, so if the Tesno case showed us science overpowering folklore to deliver legal truth, our next deep dive, the horror of Bridget Cleary. This shows what happens when superstition tragically lethally wins the battle against emerging modernity and common sense.
I'm moving to Tipperary in March of 1895.
And the setting here, the geographical and cultural setting, it's everything, isn't
it? It is. Rural Ireland in the 1890s was a true place of transit. It was caught between tradition and a future that included railways and telegraphs and a growing sense of economic independence. But the landscape itself, it was defined by ancient stories.
The good people.
The good people. The fairy. And they weren't, the sentimental figures we think of today. They were powerful, unpredictable entities, and their wrath genuinely deep.
And Bridget Cleary herself, she seems to embody the friction between these two worlds. At 26, she was a symbol of this new independence. She was a professional dressmaker, financially self-sufficient. She often earned more than her husband, Michael.
And she owned a prized Singer sewing machine, right, which in that context was just this potent symbol of self-reliance and modernity.
And her independence was a source of tension, deep, particularly.
Oh, absolutely. He was a cooper, he was struggling to find steady work, and the social dynamic was just flipped on its head. He felt jealous. He felt deeply embarrassed that his wife held the main financial power. He expected a traditional, compliant wife.
And her confidence, her success, it made her stand out. Made her an easy target for local gossip and suspicion when things started to go wrong.
And the specific location of their home seemed to amplify all those local superstitions. It was like a confirmation to the neighbors that the good people were always close by.
Right, they lived near a ferry fort.
They did. The couple had secured a nice cottage, but it was built right on the edge of an old ring ferry fort. In Tipperary, these sites were deeply respected and feared, believed to be the domain of the fairies. No one else wanted to live there. So the very walls of their home served as this constant reminder of the ancient world present.
So when Bridget falls ill in early March, after delivering eggs near the Kylan-Granahell ferry fort, the stage is set for tragedy.
She presented with a high fever, shivering, cough. A physician visited and diagnosed a severe cold, maybe bronchitis. A priest even visited to administer last rites, which shows how serious.
But as the illness lingered, and it became cyclical, she'd seen better, then worse medicine and traditional faith started to lose ground to this ancient fear.
Neighbors started whispering, shh. They looked at her feverish eyes, her exhaustion, and they concluded she was too changed, couldn't be the real Brit.
And then the ultimate authority on folklore arrived, Jack Dunn, the local Shanaki.
The traditional storyteller. The repository of oral history and, crucially, fairy law. Unlike the local doctor or the priest, the Shanaki spoke a language everyone there. Dunn observed her trembling, her pallor, and he declared the fatal judgment. That is not your wife.
Claimed she was a changeling.
A sickly fairy replica left behind while the real healthy Bridget was being held captive by the good.
This diagnosis must have offered Michael, a terrifying but also a comforting explanation for what was happening at home.
Exactly. Michael was already struggling with his own. His mother had suffered a severe mental decline, spent time in a psychiatric hospital. The idea of madness or a loved one being replaced haunted.
So the changeling narrative gave him a sense of control.
A perverse sense of control, yes. And a cultural pretext for his own violent frustration with Penda. He was told he could fight the fairies, he could get his true wife back, so he consulted a fairy doctor, returned with this bitter herbal concoction, and the torture.
On March 13th and 14th, the situation escalated into a full-blown exorcism ritual.
A crowd gathered inside that small cottage. Michael, her elderly father, Patrick Boland, her Aunt Mary Kennedy, and 3 physically strong Kennedy cousins. Bridget, half delirious from fever and fear, was physically restrained by the 3 cousins.
And they force-fed her this horrible mix.
This foul herbal mix, and significantly milk because fairies were thought to crave dairy. The goal was to force the changeling to reveal itself and flee, leaving the real Bridget behind.
And they escalated the humiliation and the pain.
They splashed holy water on her. Then they hurled urine, which the source material calls a filthy, humiliating cure, over her to repel the supposed demonic presence. Then came the physical violence. Michael seized a metal poker, heated it until it glowed red in the fire.
Oh, God.
And repeatedly brought it near her mouth, demanding she confess she was a fairy. Witnesses later disagreed on whether he actually burned her with it, but the intent was clear. Forced act.
And in the middle of all this, her own father, Patrick Boland, is participating, demanding she declare her name.
The heartbreaking sound that was recorded in the testimonies was just Bridget's screams, her pleading for mercy, for help, but there were 10 people there and they were listening to the story, not to the woman.
They were completely in its grip.
Completely. When Michael's father died during this period, Jack Dunn immediately used it to confirm the fairy's malice. He said it was a distraction designed to pull Michael away from his mission. And this just cemented the family's descent into this collective delusion.
We moved to Friday, March 15th, and there's this brief moment of hope. Bridget seemed to improve. She's sitting up, she's dressing in her best clothes, her stylish black church dress and cloak. It seemed like maybe the illness was finally passing.
But the family was hypervigilant. They were watching her every move. And the trigger for what happened next was absurdly mundane, yet fake.
She asked for milk in her tea.
And for Michael, who was just steeped in paranoia and the Shannaki's influence, this was it. This was the final, undeniable proof changelings crave milk.
She knew what he was thinking, didn't she? Joanna Burke later testified that Bridget fought back. She told Michael he was mentally unstable, that he had fairies on the brain because his mother had been troubled by them.
And that struck right at Michael's deepest insecurity. That confrontation led directly to the final, terrifying ritual, the Rule of Three.
What's the Rule of Three?
In fairy law, if a changeling is challenged 3 times, it must flee. Michael grabbed bread, spread jam, and cut 3 pieces. He forced Bridget to eat each piece, demanding after, "Are you Bridget Boland, the wife of Michael Cleary, in the name of God?"
She answered yes, twice, but the first 2 weren't.
On the third, the crucial question, the ultimate test, Bridget hesitated, maybe from exhaustion, maybe from fear, but she paused a breath too long, and Michael snapped. He jammed the remaining bread into her mouth, choked her, pressed his knee onto her chest.
And this scene moves from this ritualistic torture to just outright murder.
Michael grabbed her. He dragged her half-naked body to the open hearth. He poured lamp oil over her, likely from a kerosene lamp, and then he used a flaming log to set her on fire. The source materials are chilling. They note how quickly the smoke and fire filled that small cottage.
And the moral horror of this event lies not just with the killer, but with the bystanders. 10 people, including her own father, her cousins, they stood by and watched Bridget burn to death.
That paralysis is as damning as Michael's action. Patrick Kennedy, one of the cousins, he later admitted he begged Michael not to burn her, but he made absolutely no physical effort to stop.
Their cultural fear was stronger than their basic human.
It was. Michael, utterly calm, expressionless, watched her burn and declared, "Not my wife. She's an old deceiver." He then locked all the witnesses in the smoke-filled cottage, demanded
the disposal of the body. It was treated not as a criminal act, but as the final necessary stage of the ritual.
That's right. Michael and his cousin Patrick Kennedy, they carried the charred remains to a shallow ditch near the Kylan-Grana Hill Ferry Fort, the very edge of the ferry dome. Michael then waited near the fort for 3 consecutive nights, gripping and
convinced she would return.
He was convinced his real wife would ride back on a white horse and he would have to cut her free from the fairy spell.
The investigation started because, despite him locking him in, rumors like that inevitably spread.
They did, and Michael's stories kept changing. First, it was about an Eggman lover, then about needing a gun to rescue her. None of it held up.
And it was Jack Dunn, the Shanaki, who eventually broke.
Yes. Horrified by the lethal outcome of his own belief system, he eventually convinced Michael to confess. The police found the body on March 22nd. She was covered with freshly cut thorn branch, which is a sign of a protective ritual, not just concealment. Her body was charred, but remarkably, her face was somehow intact, preserved by the cold, which confirmed the identities for the witness.
At the sensational trial in July 1895, the legal argument hinged entirely on the motive. The key prosecution witness, Joanna Burke, she revealed Bridget's whispered fear that Michael had been threatening to burn her for months.
And this detail suggested that the fairy narrative, it wasn't the sole catalyst for the violence. It was a convenient, culturally endorsed pretext.
The prosecution argued that Michael used folklore as a weapon.
Yes, because Bridget's independence and modernity had fundamentally threatened his fragile male status. The changeling's story provided the cultural permission he needed for spousal control.
The defense, of course, focused on the collective delusion. They argued that everyone there genuinely believed they were performing a desperate folk cure to save Bridget, not committing murder.
Justice O'Brien, the judge, ultimately sided with a more nuanced view. He ruled out murder, which required clear premeditation and intent to kill. Instead, he called it a lethal combination of superstition, fear, and brutal.
So Michael Cleary was found guilty of manslaughter.
And sentenced to 20 years. The others, including her father, received shorter sentences in assault, acknowledging their physical participation in the torture burning.
What did her father?
Patrick Boland got 6 months. Jack Dunn, the storyteller, got 3 years. The sentences acknowledged that the belief system itself was culpable.
The political legacy of this case, particularly in Britain and America, it was profound and ugly.
Oh, it was sensationalized globally, with lurid, often inaccurate accounts calling Bridget the last witch burned in Ireland. And crucially, it was seized upon by opponents of Irish Home Rule, the movement for Irish self-government.
How so?
Opponents argued that if rural Irish Catholics were still burning people based on primitive changeling superstitions, they were clearly unfit to run a modern autonomous state. It was used as political ammunition.
But labeling Bridget as a witch just fundamentally misses the entire point of the tragedy.
Absolutely. She wasn't killed for practicing witchcraft. She was killed because she was identified as a changeling, a non-human replacement. And that distinction is vital. She was a modern, independent woman whose defiance struck at Michael's insecurity. The folklore became the mechanism by which he and the community chose a dangerous, controlling story over her life. It just illustrates the destructive power of choosing belief.
Okay, we've seen scientific certainty in Germany and superstitious tragedy in Ireland. Now we turn to our final case, the vanishing of Pauline Picard in 1922. And this illustrates the third crossroad, a case where modernity, equipped with all its emerging forensic and investigative techniques, just failed.
It did. The facts themselves became so contradictory that no coherent narrative could ever emerge.
We're going to go à Saladou in Brittany, France, 1922. The setting is key.
It is. This was an isolated farming community. The family spoke Breton, they used oil lamps, they relied on horse carts. It was a truly rural existence, lagging far behind Paris or other industrialized centers.
And 2.5-year-old Pauline Picard, who is known to be curious and independent, she headed out to play with her siblings on April 6, 1922, wandered out of sight. And when she didn't return for supper, the alarm was raised.
The search over the next few weeks was monumental. 150 people meticulously combed the fields, the ditches, the woods. She had just vanished without it.
The initial theories covered all the obvious things. She wandered off, was attacked by animals, abducted by Romani groups, or these two unknown strangers who had been seen in the area.
And they had one key suspect early on, Christoph Karen.
Who was?
He was a 50-year-old man with a prior conviction for assaulting a child, and he'd done odd jobs on the Picard farm. He was even overheard speaking ominously about finding Pauline a new home. He fit the profile of a predator perfectly.
But the police, demonstrating this new, modern investigative rigor, they located him 200 miles away and verified his alibi with multiple independent witnesses. Karaman was ruled out, and the case went completely cold.
Then, about a month later, came this. Impossible relief. A child matching Pauline's description was found wandering alone in the bustling port city of Cherbourg, over 200 miles away, a world away from that isolated.
And the Picards, Francois and Marianne, they made the long journey to Cherbourg. And their desperation to believe this was their daughter was, you can feel it, was palpable.
Francois, the father especially, he was immediately convinced. He cited her eyes, the shape of her mouth, her ear. The identification was immediate and emotional.
But right away, there were these glaring contradictions that were just willfully ignored in the rush of relief.
Unmistakable contradiction. The child was noticeably thinner and paler than Paul. She was wearing completely different clothes. She didn't seem to recognize the Picards at all, and she did not speak a single word of
which was the family's language.
Their native tongue.
Yeah.
And the child was just silent.
So how did the authorities explain away such critical discrepancies?
Well, the doctors and investigators, they attributed the silence and the lack of recognition to aphasia, the inability to speak or comprehend language caused by extreme emotional or physical trauma.
The theory was the trauma had induced temporary amnesia and muteness.
Exactly. And because the parents were so insistent, the authorities just accepted the identification. The girl was released from Picard's care.
On the train ride back, the child uttered 3 words in Breton: yes, no, and dad, which must have given the Picards and the accompanying nurses immense hope.
It did. The entire village welcomed her back, accepting this idea that she was Pauline, just deeply traumatized. But once she was inside the familiar farmhouse, the doubt became this chilling reality.
She was distant.
Profoundly distant. She didn't recognize her old toys or her siblings. She treated them like strangers. And crucially, when she was brought to the exact field where Pauline was last seen, she became violently hysterical, crying, uncontrollable, trying to escape.
And the nurses interpreted this as confirmation.
Yes. They saw it as Pauline reacting to the sight of her trauma. It was all explained away about trauma until the visit from the neighbor, Eve Martin, which just solidified the...
Martin was the man considered simple because of the head injury.
Right. And therefore, perhaps, an unvarnished truth-teller, he visited, stared intensely at the Cherbourg girl, and then burst into this manic laughter, shouting, "So the little one's back, are you sure it's her? God forgive me, I'm guilty." He then ran away and was committed to a psychiatric hospital, raving and unable to clarify what he meant.
So the police have a supposed confession, but from a man who may have been completely delusional.
The situation was already impossibly confusing. A girl who looked right but acted wrong, with the possible confession from an unreliable source, and then the entire narrative just violently.
Just 2 weeks after the Cherbourg girl was welcomed home, on May 26th, A local farmer discovered a decomposed, headless body of a small child in a shallow ditch about a mile from the Picard farm.
And the evidence found at the scene was immediately and impossibly contradictory to that happening.
The clothes.
The clothes. They were found neatly folded beside the naked, mutilated corpse, a dress and a pair of clogs. And they were the exact clothes Pauline Picard was wearing when she vanished on April 6th.
Okay, let's just pause on the impossible fact this presents. This location, an open field just a mile from the farm, had been meticulously searched multiple times by over 100 people, by police, by specialized bloodhounds.
Which means the body could not have been there for weeks. It had been placed there recently, possibly after the searches were completed, and potentially even after the Cherbourg girl had been identified and returned.
The implication this was a staged crime or a cover-up intended to close the case.
And the mutilations were highly specific. They suggested a deliberate attempt to obstruct identification. The head, hands, and feet, the primary means of identification.
And the abdomen was intact.
Mysteriously intact, which is unusual as it's usually the first area targeted by scalp. There was also a specific puncture wound described as 1 by 2 centimeters in the groin, suggesting a targeted.
The other details defy logic, too. The adult male skull nearby, the strange state of the footwear.
Yes. About 2 meters away, they discovered a partially scavenged adult male skull. Was this a second victim? Killer? A total coincidence? And the clogs belonging to Pauline had clean, dry straw packed in their soles, which is completely inconsistent with weeks of decomposition and exposure in a wet, muddy. The whole scene just screamed deliberate state.
Yet, despite all this evidence pointing towards staging, murder, and recent place, officials quickly ruled the death accident, exposure, and starvation, with scavengers causing the dismemberment. Why the rush to close the case?
The belief was likely that they just needed to close the file and resolve the community's trauma. But the public, including local journalists, they highlighted the absurdity of it all. How could bloodhounds and dozens of searchers miss a body a mile away? The folded clothes, the specific mutilation, it all fueled widespread speculation of a complicated murder plot or a deliberate cover-up by someone close to the family.
With the body found and the clothes identified, the authorities could no longer ignore the physical inconsistencies between the remains and the girl living at the Picard farm.
The medical evidence became the final, irrefutable nail in the coffin of the misidentification. Pauline Picard had been recorded as 77 centimeters tall. The Cherbourg girl was only 60 centimeters.
That's a huge difference.
A massive, and more definitively, Pauline had 8 moles. The Cherbourg girl had only 2. Height and dental records are objective biological markers. You can't dismiss them with trauma or amnesia. They confirmed the misidentification was undeniable.
So the Cherbourg girl was quietly sent to an orphanage in June, confirming she was not Pauline. But the identity paradox, it didn't end there. It just got...
This is perhaps the most bizarre twist in the whole story. Weeks later, at the orphanage where she was surrounded by people who only spoke French, the Cherbourg girl suddenly began speaking fluent Breton. She called out the names of the Picard children, Henriette, Elaine, and she referenced the family donkey, the horse, the well by the barn, using the precise, intimate phrasing Pauline had used at home.
So this reignited the entire debate. Was she Pauline after all, suffering from some extreme trauma-based amnesia that eventually reversed, despite the impossible medical evidence of her height and teeth? Which evidence do you trust? The irrefutable biological data or the specific emotional linguistic proof?
The facts had become mutually exclusive, and this uncertainty gave rise to numerous, often theatrical theories. The most widespread was the wealthy couple,
which suggested Pauline was kidnapped and sold to a wealthy childless couple in northern France who had lost their sole heir.
Right, and the theory claimed this couple, needing to close the police investigation to secure their inherited child, murdered their own child, mutilated the body, and dressed it in Pauline's clothes before planting it near the Picard home.
That would explain the stage scene, the clothes, the recent placement, but it's impossible to prove.
Yeah.
And just requires this enormous amount of coordinated malevolence.
And then there was the family violence.
This suggested Pauline was killed by a family member, possibly the father, Francois, who was known for violent outbursts. And Eve Martin, the simple neighbor, was seen as an actual witness to the violence.
Under this interpretation, Francois' insistence that the Cherbourg girl was Pauline wasn't happiness, but guilt-driven misdirect closed the case.
But this theory still fails to account for the killer's action. Why would a family member trying to cover up a murder put Pauline's specific identifying clothes next to the body? It makes no sense.
Exactly. Every single theory fails to account for at least one critical physical piece of evidence. The height and teeth mismatch of the living girl, the staging of the body, the clean straw and the clogs, or the sudden return of the Breton light.
The Cherbourg girl, who was renamed Marie-Louise Pauline, she died of measles in 1924, aged almost 5, and her true identity remains unknown.
The case remains officially unsolved because the facts are just too contradictory to allow modern investigations. solve the horror. A child was murdered and a child was misidentified, and the killer or killers successfully managed to introduce such pervasive uncertainty that the legal truth just vanished. The uncertainty itself became the case during.
So let's zoom out and synthesize this incredible journey. We've examined 3 horrific acts committed within a span of 27 years across 3 vastly different European cultures, all of them standing right at the precipice of the modern.
We saw in the Ludwig Tesno case how the voice of science provided this cold, undeniable cert. Uhlenhuth's precipitin test silenced the werewolf rumors. It established species-specific blood testing as irrefutable legal tool, and it irrevocably changed the land. It forced jurisprudence to embrace the forensic.
Then we saw in the Bridget Cleary case what happens when the grip of ancient belief is stronger than clear physical evidence and just common sense. Folklore became a cultural permission structure. It was weaponized to justify violence against a woman whose independence threatened the established social order. Superstition tragically won that battle.
And finally, in the Pauline Picard mystery, we saw a case where the facts themselves became so tangled and contradictory, biological markers versus linguistic memory, staged crime scenes versus missed evidence, that even modern investigation techniques failed to deliver any clarity. Certainty was just lost in a fog of conflict.
The common, terrifying thread running through all 3 of these stories is the human desperation for a narrative. When you're faced with incomprehensible violence or uncertainty, people will grasp for any explanation, whether it's werewolves or fairies or a trauma-induced aphasia, anything to make the underlying human depravity feel comprehensible.
In the Tesno case, the dead finally got a voice, and it ended centuries of superstition-based excuses for these brutal crimes. The court started trusting the lab coat over the defendant's calm.
In the Cleary case, we saw that belief can be an active choice, a refusal to see the uncomfortable truth. Calling Bridget a changeling allowed a room full of people to choose a violent, culturally acceptable story over her life. It justified control.
And in the Picard case, the fact that 2 children, one living and one dead, could be simultaneously connected to the same identity based on evidence, that's the ultimate horror. The modern world provided all the tools, but the truth just remained hidden in the chaos.
And here's where it gets really interesting as we connect this to the bigger picture. We often operate under this comforting delusion that modern knowledge automatically dispels ancient fears and bias. But these cases show that the collision between what we deeply believe and what we can actually prove creates the most dangerous blind spot, historically and today.
Which raises a provocative question. We may have moved beyond whispering about, but what powerful, deeply ingrained per day that might be preventing your evidence stack narrative. That collision time and the consequence one over the other still off.